We talk about BibFrame in a bibliographic framework, but the reality is we're trying to basically design something that literally is both capturing the content in which we've created over the past 40 years, but to go back to the early Dublin Core discussion, flexible enough that it can evolve for the next 40 years as well. That's no easy task. We're not talking about libraries. We're talking about the larger memory organization space. When my child has a report to do on Abraham Lincoln, he is not thinking about going to the library to find information about that, and the archive, and the museum. Guess what? He's thinking about Google. Right? The institutional boundaries that we have around memory organizations are artificial to the users we serve. And the ability to break those barriers down is what this is trying to do. And finally, and most importantly, and perhaps most unclearly, again, not just using the web as a delivery mechanism, but being very much of the web. That's a very important distinction, and it is very unclear. But in short, it's about using the web identifiers, using the way the web talks as a way of representing the data that we in the library, museum, and archive community are curating. So in the context of those Legos, if you go to the BibFrame site, one way of characterizing what's being developed there is just a whole bunch of Legos. And there's a lot of them, because basically trying to represent a lot of the past 40 years is kind of painful. MARC as a standard has been one of the longest, it has been the longest interchange standard of any industry. It has grown, it has adapted, it has morphed, it's grown a third arm. I mean, it has basically done things because the community has basically done this. And it's reached a point where, in fact, it's not evolving in an effective and efficient way. But trying to basically think about how to reflect that in the web is a non-trivial task. And BibFrame is an attempt to basically take on that non-trivial task. Of the various different standards and the various different drafts and the various different documents and thoughts around there, one of these is related to the discussion at hand, and one of the things that I think actually the Dublin Core can help significantly move forward. And this is this notion of being able to take subsets of those Legos and do interesting things with them. In fact, we don't need to basically have all the Legos to build interesting shapes. We just need to be very clear about some of the shapes that we're interested in. And the profile work can be thought of as sort of taking parts of those Legos and assembling them in small, digestible, useful shapes in a way that very specialized, very specific communities can benefit from. Now, I'm not going to basically tell you which one of these things might be RDA, Angry Bird. Which one of these things might be simpler than others? Which one of them might be more useful than others? What I'm trying to say is that, in fact, we can take some of these building blocks and assemble them for very specific uses and connect to the people that basically need it, rather than trying to sort of game the system, which is our current status pro in terms of status quo, in terms of MARC. And the profile work that basically is being discussed in BibFrame is directly built on the profile work that was basically being discussed 14 years ago from Dublin Core. If anything, the way I would characterize it is actually the profile work in BibFrame is actually more relaxed. It's less about constraints. It's less about validation. It's more about packaging. And frankly, packaging, best practices, consensus goes a long way in terms of consistency. Guess what? MARC has no validation inside of it. So BibFrame profiles gives us a common model. BibFrame gives us a common model to start doing this. And one of the things I want to sort of make a point about BibFrame as a common model, for 2 months prior to designing BibFrame, we looked around at all of the linked data implementations that different national libraries, regional libraries, museums, archives, etc. were doing. We queried APIs, we looked at the patterns inside of the data, we tried to do frequency distribution over the vocabularies we were using, we tried to see if we were identifying common patterns. Guess what? The only common pattern that we could really identify was that everyone called it linked data. Dublin Core was used a lot in terms of its namespace, but the consistency in which Dublin Core was used, there was none. DC Creator had a range of a URI, DC Creator had a literal, DC Creator had a literal that inside of it had HTTP : ... Right. So trying to build systems that combined this information, they were all linked data, but they were all not linkable. So part of what we were trying to do in BibFrame is identify those things that were common patterns. Not introducing new patterns, but could we identify common patterns across these things? As a way of sort of saying, look, there's been a lot of precedence and a lot of work. Can we come up with a common way in which we could map from what we're existing doing to the minimal subset, to then start combining this together and build off of the network effect in which libraries, museums, and archives actually have a huge possibility of leading. So we might not like some of the design patterns in BibFrame. You might not like BibFrame at all. I know some of you don't. But the point is that we need to get past this. Because what's at stake is too important. We need to figure out ways in which we can take some of these principles and take some of these patterns and reflect our data in a way that maximizes their use. And that's what these blueprints do. So I want to talk briefly about a project that we did with the National Library Board of Singapore and how this fits together. And this is my poor attempt at basically describing this. But it's similar for those that are familiar with cascading style sheets with BibFrame profiles. The notion here is, in the context of the National Library Board of Singapore, what we were tasked to do was, can you come up with a linked data architecture that integrates all of our stuff? And everyone basically, that's a challenging problem, especially in that context where the National Library Board of Singapore now basically has the National Museum and the National Archives as part of its institutional ownership. So in essence, how do you basically make it possible to tie together monographs, serials, music, rare books, videos, archives, images, etc., all which basically surprisingly have different data formats, and all which surprisingly have different data standards? And can we magically make this into one possible system that we can deliver effective services and solutions to our users? It sounds fun. It's actually really tough.